A lot of what I'll talk about today is all directly relevant to nature and biodiversity financing and how we govern nature restoration and biodiversity. But actually, many of the cases or the cases that I'll be discussing are not necessarily directly biodiversity or nature cases, but for reasons that we'll get to, that it is all relevant. This paper is or was part of my PhD research, which I did at IIPP at UCL. And this paper specifically was based on 3 months of field work and lots of interviews in Chile, which I did in 2022. It's still under review, this paper. It's been one of these ones that's been kind of under development for a long time as part of my PhD, but I'm kind of very excited about, I feel like it's almost ready to get out into the world, so I'm very excited to be sharing it with you today. And yes, a lot of the kind of themes that it touches on and that I talk about in the paper and things that we look at in terms of the on-the-ground governance practices that have happened and what's changed and what hasn't changed in the development of state capacity is also relevant for, I think, many of the things that you explore within this institute as well. I'm going to start here, which is a place that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the Paris agreements signed slightly outside of Paris, about 15 kilometers north of Paris in 2015, or agreed back in 2015. And there's lots of discussion about what the Paris Agreement was, how it was achieved, all of these kinds of things. The thing that I've been interested in my research is how it constituted a transformation or a shift in the role of the state, or brought forth a shift in the role of the state in global climate governance. Again, this is something that lots of people have been writing about and discussing, both qualitatively what it meant for the role of the state, but also what it meant in terms of government spending, or what it required in terms of public spending. So it's widely kind of recognized as the time when governments became the central coordinating actor, or states became the central coordinating actor in climate governance. And key to this was governments committed to submitting these short to medium term plans, again, that I'm sure many people here are familiar with, detailing how they would meet their obligations, their domestic obligations. And again, lots of issues with how those domestic obligations would be determined, etc. But it brought forth, nonetheless, this kind of new commitment for governments to be the actor responsible for pursuing these obligations. Crucially, these NDCs, these plans, would be multi-sectoral and economy-wide, so they were not just targeting renewable energy and transport, despite that, as many of you might be aware, that is where almost all, or the great majority of climate finance flows have gone since 2015, is to energy and transport sectors for both mitigation and adaptation, but also other sectors of the economy. By 2023, at least 70 countries had extended plans to pursue carbon neutrality or net zero. 27 countries had passed domestic climate laws, and usually when they passed these domestic climate laws, they'd also develop kind of national or long-term climate strategies, or long-term climate mitigation strategies at least, that were then mandated to be pursued under these framework laws. And within the NDCs, again, so almost all countries, I think barring Libya, have submitted or did submit by 2023 at least one iteration of their NDC. They're kind of in varying degrees of detail. Again, there's lots of literature on this in case anyone is interested in this, but certainly many countries had developed or adopted these very detailed plans, or what we would consider within governance research more broadly to be pretty comprehensive, insofar as they had clear deadlines for action, clear measurable targets for mitigation, and in some cases adaptation as well. And then within the academic research, within my kind of areas of international political economy and governance, there has been renewed interest in what this kind of state coordinated climate governance and green industrial policy means. So this kind of resurgence of industrial policy tools as a way to achieve objectives, again, particularly in energy and transport. And we've seen the kind of renewal of debates, or resurgence of debates on concepts like the environmental or the green state. Again, a lot of this is probably not, I'm sure, not new to anyone in the room here or online, but the kind of overarching consensus is that we are way off track to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement of limiting the formal goal, as well as to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, but also the ambition to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this is true even in places like Denmark, which, in climate action tracker and all of these kind of other indexes that exist, is usually held up as a kind of pioneer or leader, both in terms of its policy ambition and in terms of its emissions that it has achieved and that it's on track to achieve. Denmark is still kind of way off track in achieving these goals. So this is the depressing part of the presentation, actually. But I'm sure none of this is new. The global stocktake last year, the first comprehensive stocktake of the Paris Agreement, found that governments were way off track. A lot of my research has been interested in this question of why are states failing to implement plans? And again, I consciously center states and governments here as the actor that is mandated to implement these plans. So within, again, my kind of fields of academic research in comparative political science research and in governance and political economy, these are the kind of three main arguments or the three main areas of focus that we've seen. So one is around policy backsliding. So we're seeing states failing to implement their plans because actually governments are increasingly less interested, or the politicians, elected politicians, are increasingly less interested in pursuing these plans. And that is often viewed as being due to distributive conflicts. And this is kind of a broader literature where we're seeing kind of huge success in the development or in the kind of expansion of electric vehicles, for example. This is also viewed as being in large part due to there being a kind of broader industrial state coalition that is supportive of this, for example. The big one we hear all the time is the financing gap, the green transition financing gap, the net zero financing gap. You have a biodiversity financing gap as well. So one of the things that the Paris Agreement also did was one of the agreements that was reached as part of the agreement was to increase government spending on climate mitigation and a little bit on adaptation as well. And these these goals have been debated and negotiated kind of ever since. But again, the consensus is we're way off track. And then the argument is that if governments and the private sector were able to mobilize more finance, then we would be more on track. And then the other kind of third group of literature looks at the actual legal framework of the Paris Agreement. And this is closely related to research looking at climate change, collective action problems or collective action approaches. So people like Copenhagen and Oppenheimer and many others, recognize that the Paris Agreement does not have a particularly robust legal framework, right? It's the pledge and review system that is based on governments committing to achieve these goals and then being held to account by their peers. But no government is going to go to jail, to put it, if they don't achieve their objectives. That the kind of enforcement mechanisms doesn't exist beyond these kind of enforcement mechanisms. So I've been researching state capacity for a long time, and I became interested in actually whether there was also a story about government's ability to implement and pursue these policies once they have adopted them. So in these cases of these governments that I discussed at the beginning, where this nice plan has been developed and adopted, and it's also enshrined in some kind of legislation, in these cases, is there an issue with governments actually, their ability in terms of their capabilities, their skills, the organizations that they have, the resources that they have to be able to regulate, to be able to coordinate across sectors, to be able to coordinate internally within or across departments within government, and also to be able to discipline actors that were not, or discipline market actors in particular, that were not willing to reduce emissions or act in ways that were pursuant to the goals and the strategies, the plans that governments had agreed. And then because I'm also, political economist, I'm very interested in, how might these dynamics of the global political economy unfold and affect the development of state capacity for implementing domestic green transition policies. Okay, so why state capacity? What do I mean with state capacity? I do have another paper that I can circulate if anyone is interested in state capacity and green transitions, what we mean when we're talking about this, because it's one of these concepts that, because it also has a kind of intuitive understanding, also within academic literature, we find it kind of being thrown about a lot in reference to lots of different things. So the starting point is that decarbonisation, so climate change mitigation, and particularly decarbonisation, need transformative state capacity to coordinate plans, manage investments, and confront oppositions. You can throw as much money at something as you like, but actually if you don't have the governance structures in place, the ministries, the people, the ability to build relationships, the skills, the technological infrastructure, etc., and the resources to be able to pursue these policies, you're not going to be able to do that. So I take as my starting point literature on state capacity that kind of goes back a very long way to the 1980s, and this body of research under what was called the developmental state, or under the concept of the developmental state, which originated really among some scholars in the US and some in Australia who were looking at how and why particularly states in East Asia had been successful at pursuing industrial upgrading and what role the state had played in achieving these outcomes. So Scotchpole describes or defines state capacity as the ability to implement official goals, especially over the actual or potential opposition of powerful social groups or in the face of recalcitrant socioeconomic circumstances. So again, this kind of question of there being resistance, or the fact that there is often resistance from incumbent actors, for example, and this is quite key in green transitions and energy transitions, right, is also important to bear in mind when we're talking about state capacity. So what these developmental state scholars viewed as important was this coherent bureaucratic machinery, including they were particularly interested in things drawing on the ideas of Max Weber, meritocratic recruitment and long-term careers. More recently, scholars have tried to look at, again, the kind of more organizational or micro level at what this entails in terms of the actual roles, resources, and capabilities that organizations have. And then this kind of final bullet point here comes from a lot of the more recent literature looking at state capacity for green transitions, where I suggest that we can kind of group this into both these positive capacities or internal capacities for adaptation and coordinating for wicked and climate policies, but also these negative capacity, or what has been described as strategic capacity, to confront these powerful interests. So I was interested in, first of all, looking at, okay, if we want to know what affects the development of state capacity for implementing green transition initiatives, a lot of the literature, or some of the literature on green transitions governance from within political economy is looking at the role of how domestic growth strategies affect policy design, and also fiscal spending in green industrial policy. So, for example, this paper by Kutzuk and Nam was looking at how we actually see more fiscal spending, and this is perhaps not surprising, but it was great to document in countries where there is a large decarbonizable sector. So that could be like electric vehicles, for example, or a large vehicles sector. Like Germany is a good example of this. We tend to see more fiscal spending for decarbonisation because that sector has the potential to be transformed. There's also been research looking at how the growth strategies and the role of the finance ministry in pursuing a particular growth strategy also affects the development or the design of green industrial policy, if it undermines or might be seen to undermine a financialized accumulation growth model. So this is a paper by Craig looking at the role of treasury control in the UK government. It was super interesting. What this literature suggests is that the growth strategy that a government or a finance ministry is pursuing also affects the design of policy design and fiscal spending in green industrial policy. But we have to assume that when it comes to actually implementing the policies, even if we're able to get to the stage where we have what we can think of as a nice strategy, a well-designed strategy with a clear plan, goals that seem reasonable, we assume that these dynamics don't disappear, right? The growth strategy that a government is pursuing doesn't disappear even in cases where governments have demonstrated clear political will and adopted a nice multi-sectoral plan for decarbonisation. And we can also assume that these dynamics, for various reasons, are stronger in countries with limited fiscal space. So where there actually is less room to be investing in, for the state to do these kind of long-term investments in decarbonisation. Okay, and then the other question that I was interested in, which is related to this question of the role of a particular growth strategy and state capacity, is the role that the paradigm of de-risk decarbonisation as the kind of the defining climate finance regime of our age, how this might also affect the development of state capacity for implementing initiatives across different sectors. So countries operating under fiscal and monetary constraints are also more likely to be recipients of finance for economic development and climate infrastructure from multilateral, regional, and international state development and investment banks. And what we've seen, and this has been discussed by people like Daniela Gabor and Nick Bernards, is within both development finance, but then related to this within climate finance and within infrastructure project finance, there has been a shift since around the middle of a kind of qualitative shift in the language and a kind of policy approach to climate financing and development financing since the early 2010s, and then a more substantive shift since around the Paris Agreement, where increasingly climate finance from these sources, so from public sources and multilateral development banks, has increasingly been used as a way, as not just a kind of direct investment, but explicitly to leverage or mobilize further financing from private sector sources. And that includes commercial banks, but increasingly has come to include asset management funds, for example. So this phenomenal, or this kind of qualitative shift, this regime change, as other people might call it, within the world of climate finance and within multilateral development banks has been described in terms of de-risking development, or the private turn in development finance, and again have been kind of put down to this material need to meet the climate finance gap that we talked, or the green transition, net zero climate finance gap, whatever we want to call it, that we discussed at the beginning. So the idea is essentially that national governments or multilateral development banks assume the risks of early stage investment in infrastructure and R&D through providing subsidies and guarantees in exchange for receiving this finance from multilateral development banks, and introducing reforms to remove the regulatory barriers that disincentivize institutional investors and kind of commercial bank investment as well. And the perceived strength, important to note, is multilateral development banks, of course, they have a kind of mandate to their various mandates, which mean that they're not solely kind of profit-driven institutions, right? They're not looking for short-term returns in the way that private sector investors often are. There is, again, I won't spend too much time talking about how they differ, but one of the things that they do look for when kind of seeking out governments or looking for projects that they might invest in order to leverage or mobilize this private sector sources of finance is the kind of perceived strength of governance institutions and the potential for them to develop state capacity, which is something that I will talk about in a minute. 4 expectations for this paper, so from the existing literature. We expect to find greater efforts to develop state capacity for implementing decarbonisation initiatives when those initiatives align with the domestic growth strategy. We also expect that the availability of de-risking finance for initiatives is associated with the development of state capacity to both ensure effective implementation of policies and management of investors and provide additional assurance to investors. We expect that where a decarbonisation initiative does not align with the domestic growth model, efforts to develop state capacity will be weaker, and we assume that these effects will be greater in states operating under kind of fiscal and monetary constraints. Which brings me, and I'm already running way behind where I should be, but we'll get to now why I decided to look at Chile to try to explore some of these dynamics. Chile is a representative case, and it meets these scope conditions. So it has clearly stated political will and comprehensive plans to pursue carbon neutrality. This is important because I wanted to control as much as obviously policy backsliding, or what we're now calling in the US administrative backsliding. This can happen in the absence of legislation, but at least literature by people like Sam Fankhauser and the group at LSE has kind of demonstrated that where there is this legislation in place, then we're less likely to see policy backsliding, right? So there's clearly stated political will. Chile has a very comprehensive NDC, but it also adopted the long-term or published a long-term climate strategy in 2021 that has, again, clear deadlines for meeting objectives. And then in 2022, it passed the Climate Change Framework Law, which mandates the government to pursue these objectives. The decarbonisation plan, as it exists, affects existing sectors that are critical to the existing growth model, so crucially mining, Copper exports in Chile are about 60% of total mining exports, and mining is by far the most critical kind of export sector of the economy, followed by plantation forestry, so pine and eucalyptus exports. Chile is a high-income country. I always like to say this because people assume that it isn't, but it is a high-income country. It has huge inequality, and it is operating under fiscal and monetary constraints. But these largely have to do with, again, the kind of export-led growth model, or the natural resources-based growth model that has these kind of historical lineages or historical legacies from the dictatorship, which I'll talk a little bit about here, but also dictatorship-era constitutional rules on limiting the role of the state in the economy. So Chile, as a high-income country, became ineligible for overseas development assistance in 2014, but multilateral development banks have continued to find ways to invest in Chile through various different mechanisms, and it has been a really important target of MDB investment and also state investment bank investment. So like German state investment banks, for example, for climate and renewable energy infrastructure projects. From the perspective of multilateral development banks, it's viewed as a relatively safe bet for project-based infrastructure investments, owing to the perception of, again, they're looking at this in kind of relative terms within the region. The World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank kind of target Latin America, and Chile is kind of seen as the golden child in many ways. So things that came out of interviews were, describing how they changed their managing director after the election, but the rest of the structure remains the same. So this managing director of a kind of government ministry cannot do that much damage to the structure because it's pretty solid and with a lot of inertia, right? So this idea that actually, because there was a lot of stability in within the ministry itself or within the government itself, this was going to be good for investors. And so multilateral development banks like Chile for this reason. So I wanted to look at, okay, how does state capacity develop across different sectors when they converge differentially with both the growth model, or the existing growth strategy, that should say, rather than growth model alignment, but with the government's growth strategy and related to the growth model, and this kind of interest of multilateral development banks or international financial institutions. So I looked at state capacity for implementing initiatives across these kind of three areas that were critical to Chile achieving its goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. So in theory, we should be seeing huge efforts to develop state capacity to implement policies across these policy areas, right? So we have green hydrogen, or the development of green hydrogen within renewable energy, native forestry protection and afforestation. I'll talk about how important that is in Chile in a minute, and mining decarbonisation. So I assumed, based on the existing literature, that what we would expect to see is kind of high efforts to develop state capacity for implementing green hydrogen, and pretty low for or maybe low for the other areas. As we'll see, it was a bit surprising actually how limited efforts in other areas were. So this is the reference, the government's reference scenario for pursuing carbon neutrality at the time that it implemented or adopted the 2021 long-term climate strategy. So we can see that sustainable industry, this includes mining, is pretty key, 25%. Or 25% of the mitigation, and this doesn't include, so within the Chilean plans, native forest afforestation is viewed as a kind of integration initiative because it's both important for adaptation as well as mitigation. But roughly 50% of the carbon neutrality scenario depends on the success of these initiatives in native forestry, right? So that they're pretty important. So methodologically, this is just, a little bit on the methods. So growth model alignment and availability of de-risking finance assessed through government and international financial institution policy documents, government spending data from IAT, interviews with senior staff and executives of international finance institutions. Okay, and then measuring state capacity. Again, I have a paper on the challenges and pitfalls of measuring state capacity. There's no perfect way to do it. And I'm happy to share that with anyone interested in looking at these or looking at kind of researching state capacity. But methodological issues include that since any capacity is the potential of doing something rather than the realization, the direct observability of this ability is a concern. Also things like the risk of like logical tautologies in state capacity research. Are we seeing emissions reductions because there's high state capacity, or vice versa, right? We can't use outcomes-based proxies as a good measure of state capacity necessarily. So I decided to kind of make sure that I was focusing on efforts. So what actually was the government doing in terms of investing in financial and human resources, strategic efforts to establish bureaucratic structures and routines in response to the green transition strategy objectives. And this was assessed again using data on government production, cost spending, and employment figures, policy documents detailing organizational structures, and interviews with current and former civil servants. So in total, there were 27 interviews that I conducted during my fieldwork, and for transparency, 20 didn't respond to my invitations. That's not a bad outcome for research with government or interviewing with government officials, and they were all recorded and transcribed. Quite unsurprisingly, we did find that there had been huge, and this kind of reflects globally what I think some of my informants described, hydrogen fever and hydrogen hype. So Chile adopted this nice comprehensive strategy for developing and implementing green hydrogen initiatives in 2020 that subsequently attracted $728 million in financing from a green hydrogen facility the green hydrogen facility that brought investment from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, KfW, the European Investment Bank, and then also shored up with additional financing from Corfo, the State Development Agency. We saw kind of huge efforts to develop state capacity for implementing these initiatives. So this new nice ring-fenced fiscal budget for government production costs, new cross-ministerial strategic committee on green hydrogen, again, evidence of like great outputs like the Green Hydrogen Action Plan, and interviews consistently described this as like the thing that the government was doing. We didn't see similar efforts to develop state capacity in either native forestry or for native forestry initiatives or mining decarbonisation initiatives. I'll talk a bit more about native forestry specifically in a minute. But yes, mining decarbonisation, as I mentioned, is kind of critical to the existing growth model. But there are also kind of key differences when we think about renewables initiatives versus mining initiatives. Mining decarbonisation initiatives involve kind of very high upfront costs on it. They're very spatially constrained and require the kind of short-term reduction of output, because the technologies and the sites that need to be decarbonised are currently being used for existing carbon-intensive mining processes, right? And this is very different to renewable energy, where you can build a wind farm at the same time as you are still producing or importing fossil fuels, right? So the kind of considerations are quite different. You would think that with mining decarbonisation is pretty critical to Chile achieving carbon neutrality. At the time that I was doing interviews, there were 1.5 people employed to implement all of the mining decarbonisation policies across the Chilean government. That was quite surprising, kind of how limited, again, investment in developing the state capacity was, and not just in terms of the resources, but we didn't see the efforts, like as I was saying with green hydrogen. There had been all of these this cross-ministerial strategic committee getting buy-in from lots of different agencies across government, and that just didn't exist in mining decarbonisation. And it didn't exist in native forestry either. I'll talk a bit about that in a second. Again, this is just a quote from Multilateral Development Bank describing how they understand the use of their investments in green hydrogen as a kind of way to de-risk private sector investments. So it really epitomized the de-risking approach. But then also, I also discussed how there had been growing European interest. And so we saw the kind of involvement of the European Investment Bank, German banks in Chilean green hydrogen projects. The German Development Agency also funded the consultancy McKinsey to develop the National Green Hydrogen Plan in 2020. And when I asked, why was that? Because by the time that I was there in 2022, already the projections for expanding green hydrogen were way off. It wasn't going to be in production or scalable in a way that the kind of initial scenarios had suggested. They were pretty frank about how, we brought McKinsey in because we're trying to attract private finance, and this was a kind of a good stamp of approval, right? So, but yes, there was lots of interest from Europe, and there's been more interest in expanding green hydrogen in Europe ever since. Now, I know we might be more interested in native forestry here, so I'm going to talk a bit more about native forestry. So yeah, carbon capture by Chile's forests accounts for about 50% of the emissions reductions in the long-term strategy. So this includes protecting not just native forests, but also pine and eucalyptus plantations. But it requires, these goals require expanding native forests. 70,000 hectares of native species, or 200,000 hectares in total by 2030. Beyond mass forest fires, which, as you may be familiar with, are a huge issue in Chile, there is competition and resistance from the incumbent plantation forestry sector. As I said, this is Chile's second biggest export sector. Again, I probably don't need to explain to this audience why pine and eucalyptus are notoriously bad sources of carbon sequestration versus, native forest. And I'm no expert in this area. I've been looking at state capacity and the governance and trying to get my head around, why is it that pine and eucalyptus are not good sources of carbon storage. The expansion of native forests don't hold growth potential, right? Beyond that can displace the export of incumbent plantation forestry to the same extent. So there might be kind of jobs created for local communities, which is really important, but it's certainly not able to displace within the kind of the government's economic strategy, the kind of growth potential of plantation forestry. As I said, second biggest export policies. Past policies since the dictatorship era of Pinochet have heavily subsidized, and actually prior to this, heavily subsidized plantation forestry. So there's been a kind of lock-in of plantation forestry and deforestation of native forests for plantation forestry in Chile. So the Ministry for the Environment and the Ministry of Agriculture are both responsible for the initiatives related to native forestry within the National Climate Plan, neither of which, for various reasons I don't have time to talk about here, have really much power within the kind of ministerial structure of the Chilean government. That's also an issue. And they work with the National Forestry Corporation, which is responsible for implementing native forest afforestation. So that's where I did interviews also with the Ministry for the Environment and the team responsible for native forestry within the Ministry for the Environment, but I focused my interviews on CONAF, which is responsible for implementing these. And in terms of the governance structure, that CONAF works then with kind of regional bodies and authorities that are primarily responsible for preventing deforestation from mass forest fires, right? That's kind of a positive, institution that could be wielded in theory for native forest afforestation projects. But yes, the Division of Natural Resources was established. It's 26 staff in 2022, handles biodiversity policies, as well as, and within this there is a Department for Climate Change and Ecosystem Services, which is responsible for the decarbonisation initiatives, was established in 2014 when Chile adopted its national natural vegetation strategy, which was really to implement the REDD+ mechanism. Again, I'm not explaining what that means. I'm assuming we know what REDD+ is. But this is interesting because essentially until 2022, there was no fiscal budget for this department, right? It relied solely on financing through the REDD mechanism and some other kind of grant-based resources, which was an issue. And this came up, without probing in interviews. Actually, this was a huge issue because it meant there was huge staff turnover. There were people coming in all the time responsible for monitoring for the REDD+ mechanism, but not developing kind of institutional capabilities that might be relevant for kind of wider native forest afforestation. When I was doing the budgetary analysis, there was the financing that was available for native forestry. There was some fiscal funding, but mostly it was coming from existing RED Plus mechanism stuff, which was just for monitoring. And again, it's worth emphasizing what's really interesting about Chile is that the kind of makeup of the capabilities of the people who work for the bureaucracy are very, very high. Many people who I met working within forestry policy had PhDs in forestry management from, top universities, top global universities. So it wasn't an issue of the knowledge or the kind of skills of the bureaucrats themselves, which is sometimes held up as an issue in some places. It was really a case of there not being the kind of resources to be able to implement these policies in the way that the strategies and plans existed. And this is just to kind of touch on something that I want to emphasize. So we often talk about the importance of kind of coalitions and governments building coalitions of business for green transition initiatives, but actually in Chile and in many parts of the world, the challenge is not the willing. There's a huge renewable energy sector that is also pro-green hydrogen because it's good for, or the green hydrogen initiatives because it's good for their interests as well, but there's huge resistance from incumbent plantation forestry actors. So Arauco, which was once upon a time a public sector forestry company that became privatized during the dictatorship, and CMPC, the other big forestry export company, account for nearly 72% of the export market and control 70% of the pine plantations and eucalyptus plantations. Mining is also a very concentrated sector, and from my interviews, a lot of the resources within mining, again, remember they're really little, these kind of decarbonisation resources, and this speaks to some of Sophus's work as well in biodiversity capacity and monitoring and state capacity, right? A lot of the resources actually go into trying to get information from the companies so that they can begin trying to implement these policies in the first place. So actually, where there is high resistance from incumbent actors, that creates a further state capacity demand for the state. What do we learn? That the first parts of this are really kind of for the political economy debates, that we have to understand interactions between the growth strategy, de-risking regimes, and state capacity to understand why these policies aren't being implemented. I argue that if we're seeing state capacity developed in areas where there is also finance or the availability of finance for de-risking investments and not in areas where this doesn't exist, we can argue that this constitutes a constraining or a shrinking of policy space for green transitions, where we're seeing, green transitions when they're bankable, but not when they're transformative, or not necessarily. That's not the same as them being transformative. We're not seeing implementation across all of these areas. And then this part, it phrases the fundamental limitations of the de-risking regime or de-risking approaches if we're actually seeing the undermining of state. If state capacity only develops when it aligns or converges with these objectives and it undermines state capacity development in other areas, then this is a problem when we're thinking about the kind of de-risking regime in total. And this is where I would argue that this is most relevant for biodiversity and nature restoration, right? Because this is an area where, from the perspective of investors, and again, you get some kind of high risk, some long-term private investors, but in general, the logic and the dynamics of private finance is that this is not an area or a sector. These initiatives are not bankable and investable in the way that renewable energy and transport initiatives are. Okay, then I tried to be positive and think about whether states can carve out policy space through creating new sources of fiscal revenue, which is something that is potentially underway to a limited extent through Chile's national lithium strategy. But I won't talk about that now because I don't have time. So thank you very much. I hope I haven't gone over too much. I knew I would talk more than I meant to, but I hope it's been interesting. Thank you.